Thomas Mitchell stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace. His red uniform perfectly pressed, and his black bearskin hat sitting tall on his head. The golden buttons on his jacket caught the morning sunlight as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras clicking endlessly. But Thomas barely noticed them anymore. His mind was thousands of miles away, in a small village in northern England, where his 8-year-old son Daniel was growing up without him. The divorce had been bitter. Sarah, his ex-wife, had moved back to her hometown after their marriage fell apart. She blamed his job for everything, the long hours, the months away from home, the ceremonies and duties that always came first. "You love that uniform more than your own family?" she had screamed during their last fight. Thomas had wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe she was right now. 3 years later, Thomas saw Daniel only. During his leave periods, 2 weeks in summer, 1 week at Christmas, and a few scattered weekends throughout the year, wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Each goodbye at the train station felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Daniel would wave from the platform, growing smaller and smaller as the train pulled away. And Thomas would wonder if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. His fellow guards knew about his situation. They saw how he stared at the photo. Tucked inside his helmet, a picture of Daniel missing his 2 front teeth. Grinning at the camera with chocolate ice cream smeared on his chin. They watched him count the days until his next leave, crossing them off on a small calendar he kept in his locker. "Why don't you just quit?" his roommate Marcus had asked one evening as they polished their boots. "Find a job closer to your boy." Thomas had looked up from his work, meeting Marcus's eyes in the reflection of the brass buckles. "This is all I know how to do," he had replied quietly. "I've been a guard for 15 years. What else would I do? Stock shelves? Work in an office?" Would that help Daniel? "At least this way, I can send money for his school, his clothes, his future." But the money felt like a poor substitute for presence. Sarah rarely answered his calls anymore, and when she did, the conversations were cold and brief. Daniel was doing well in school, she would report. He had joined the football team. He was making friends. All the normal things a growing boy should do, except his father wasn't there to see any of it. The worst part was the silence between their phone calls. Thomas would try to reach Daniel every evening after his shift, but more often than not, the boy was at practice or doing homework or simply didn't want to talk. Their conversations had grown shorter over the months, filled with awkward pauses and one-word answers. Thomas could feel the distance growing, not just in miles, but in their hearts. Standing guard required perfect stillness, but inside, Thomas was constantly moving. His thoughts raced between memories of Daniel as a toddler, running into his arms. When he came home from duty, and the reality of their current relationship, formal, distant, strained, he remembered teaching Daniel to ride a bicycle in the small garden behind their old house, running alongside him with his hand on the seat, shouting encouragement. Now he couldn't even remember the last time they had laughed together. The tourists continued to snap photos, treating the guards like living statues. They made jokes, tried to make the guards smile or move, never understanding that beneath the ceremonial uniform stood real men with real problems. Thomas had learned to tune them out, to focus on the rhythm of his breathing and the weight of his rifle. But today, something felt different. A restlessness had settled in his chest, a feeling that time was running out. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text message from Sarah. His heart jumped, hoping for news from Daniel, maybe even a photo. But when he read it later during his break, his blood ran cold. Daniel had been asking questions. Hard questions. Why didn't Daddy live with them? Why did other fathers come to school events? Was it because he had done something wrong? Thomas sat on the bench in the guardhouse, staring at the message until the words blurred. His son thought it was his fault. 8 years old, and Daniel believed he was the reason his father lived so far away. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. All his justifications, all his reasoning about duty and providing for the future, crumbled in that moment. What good was financial security if Daniel grew up believing he wasn't loved? The other guards gave him space that evening, sensing his mood. Thomas walked through Hyde Park as the sun set, past families playing on the grass. Fathers pushing children on swings, couples walking hand in hand. The scene that should have been beautiful felt like mockery. Somewhere, Daniel was going to bed in a house where his father's voice was just a memory of weekend phone calls. That night, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't keep living this half-life, being a weekend father too. A boy who needed him every day. The uniform that had once filled him with pride now felt like a prison. The honor of serving the crown suddenly seemed less important than the honor of being a real father to his son. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message to his commanding officer, requesting a meeting. His hands shook slightly as he hit send. After 15 years of unwavering service, Thomas Mitchell was about to make the hardest choice of his life. The question wasn't whether he would leave the Royal Guard. He had already decided that. The question was whether it was already too late to bridge the gap that had grown between him and Daniel as he fell asleep that night. Thomas clutched the small silver coin he kept in his pocket, a commemorative piece from the Queen's Diamond Jubilee that Daniel had admired during their last visit. He had been saving it as a gift, but now it felt like something more, a symbol of all the moments he had missed, all the conversations they hadn't had, all the love that distance had made difficult to express. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. The meeting with Colonel Harrison didn't go as Thomas had expected. He had prepared himself for anger, disappointment, maybe even accusations of abandoning his duty. Instead, the older man listened quietly as Thomas explained his situation, nodding occasionally and asking careful questions about Daniel and the growing distance between them. "You're not the first good soldier I've lost to fatherhood," Colonel Harrison said finally, leaning back in his leather chair. "And you won't be the last. The crown serves many masters, Mitchell, but family should never be forgotten in that service." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had expected a fight, but instead found understanding. The colonel explained the process for requesting a transfer to a position closer to Daniel's village. There was a small military base, about 20 miles from where Sarah lived, mostly administrative work and training new recruits. It wouldn't have the prestige of the Royal Guard, but it would give Thomas normal working hours and weekends at home. "It'll take some time to arrange," the colonel warned. "These transfers don't happen overnight. Could be several months before everything goes through." Thomas nodded, understanding. Several months felt like forever when he thought about Daniel growing more distant each day. But it was better than the years of separation that stretched ahead if he did nothing, he decided. Not to tell Sarah about his plans immediately. Their relationship was still too fragile, too filled with old hurts and accusations. She might see it as another empty promise, another way to disappoint Daniel if things fell through. Instead, Thomas focused on rebuilding his connection with his son, one phone call at a time. The next evening, instead of their usual awkward conversation about school and homework, Thomas tried something different. He told Daniel about his day, the funny tourist who tried to make him laugh, the horse that had gotten loose during the changing of the guard, the way the pigeons seemed to have personalities of their own. To his surprise, Daniel began to respond. He shared a story about his friend at school, laughed at Thomas's description of a particularly persistent pigeon named George. "Dad, do you ever get scared standing so still for so long?" Daniel asked one evening, his voice small through the phone. Thomas smiled, settling back on his narrow bed in the barracks. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But do you know what I think about when I get scared?" "What?" "I think about you. I remember teaching you to ride your bike and how brave you were even when you fell down. I think about how proud I am to be your father. And that makes me feel brave, too." There was silence on the other end, then Daniel's voice, barely a whisper. "I think about you too, Dad. Especially when Mom gets sad." Thomas's heart clenched. "Mom gets sad? Sometimes at night, she looks at old pictures and cries a little. She thinks I don't notice, but I do. I think she misses when we were all together." That conversation stayed with Thomas for days. Sarah was hurting too, despite her angry words and cold messages. Maybe the divorce hadn't been as clean and final for her as she pretended. Maybe they were all carrying wounds that hadn't properly healed. He began including small messages for Sarah when he talked to Daniel. Tell your mom I said thank you for taking such good care of you.
Oh.
Let your mom know I saw a flower today that reminded me of the ones in her garden. Small things. Careful things. Designed to show respect without pushing too hard, the paperwork for his transfer moved slowly through military channels. But Thomas's relationship with Daniel began to improve more quickly. They started reading the same book together, discussing chapters over the phone. Thomas would buy a copy of whatever Daniel was reading at school, and they would talk about the characters and plot twists. It became their special thing, a bridge across the miles. One evening in October, Daniel called with exciting news. His football team had made it to the regional finals. The match was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in 3 weeks.
Are you?
Probably can't come, Daniel said, trying to sound casual. It's okay. Mom will be there. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He was scheduled to work that weekend, a special ceremony for visiting foreign dignitaries. Missing it would mean facing serious consequences, possibly even affecting his transfer request. But the hope in Daniel's voice, carefully hidden, but still there, made the decision easy. I'll be there, Thomas said firmly, front row, cheering the loudest. Really? You promise? Promise, son. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. After hanging up, Thomas sat staring at the duty roster on his wall. He would have to request emergency leave, find someone to cover his shift, probably face disciplinary action. But for the first time in months, those consequences didn't seem to matter. Daniel needed him there, and that was enough. He spent the next week arranging coverage, calling in favors from other guards, preparing for the worst-case scenario with his commanding officer. Marcus, his roommate, shook his head but offered to take Thomas's shift without hesitation. You're crazy, Marcus said, helping Thomas polish his civilian clothes. This could ruin your transfer. Maybe, Thomas replied, but missing this match could ruin something more important. The Friday before Daniel's big game, Thomas received notification that his transfer request had been approved. He would start his new position in January, just 3 months away. The timing felt like a sign, as if everything was finally falling into place. But as he prepared for the trip north, Thomas felt nervous in a way that had nothing to do with potential disciplinary action. It had been for months since he'd seen Daniel in person, for months since he'd been in the same room as Sarah. Would things be as natural face-to-face as they had become over the phone? Would Sarah be angry that he'd come without asking permission? First, he packed carefully, including the commemorative coin he always carried. Somehow, he felt like this weekend might be the right time to give it to Daniel, not as a guilt offering or an expensive substitute for presents, but as a symbol of something new beginning between them. The train journey north felt endless. Thomas changed out of his uniform in the bathroom, trading the familiar red tunic for jeans and a simple sweater. Looking in the small mirror, he barely recognized himself. When was the last time he'd worn civilian clothes? When was the last time he'd been just Thomas, not Guard Mitchell? As the countryside rolled past the window, Thomas thought about the conversation that would have to happen with Sarah. She needed to know about the transfer, about his plans to move closer. She needed to understand that this wasn't a temporary gesture or another false promise. This was him choosing fatherhood over career, choosing love over duty, choosing the family he had lost over the life he had built without them. The train pulled into the small station just as the sun was setting. Thomas gathered his overnight bag and stepped onto the platform, his heart beating faster than it had during any ceremonial duty. Somewhere in this town, Daniel was probably getting ready for bed, excited about tomorrow's match. Somewhere here, Sarah was living the life she had built without him. Tomorrow would bring the match, the conversations that needed to happen, and the beginning of whatever came next. But tonight, for the first time in years, Thomas Mitchell was sleeping in the same town as his son. It was a small step, but it felt like coming home. Thomas woke up in the small dawn breakfast feeling more nervous than he had before any royal ceremony. He'd barely slept, running through different scenarios in his mind. What if Sarah was angry? What if Daniel felt awkward seeing him?
What?
If his presence disrupted the careful balance they had built in their lives without him? The football match was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Thomas had breakfast in the small dining room, making polite conversation with the elderly woman who ran the place, but his mind was elsewhere. He had Sarah's address from the divorce papers, but showing up unannounced at her house seemed like the wrong approach. Better to go straight to the football ground and hope for the best. At noon, Thomas walked through the town center, past shops and cafes that looked exactly like the ones from his own childhood in a similar village. Children ran between there. Parents, families headed toward the sports ground with scarves and banners. The whole community seemed to be turning out for the regional finals. The football ground was already busy when Thomas arrived. Parents were setting up folding chairs along the sideline. Kids were kicking balls around on the grass, and the smell of hot dogs and coffee drifted from a small refreshment stand. Thomas scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces, his heart pounding. Then he saw him. Daniel was with his team, wearing a bright blue jersey, his hair longer than Thomas remembered. He looked taller, more grown up, but still unmistakably his son. The sight of him hit Thomas like a physical force. How had he missed so much growth, so much change? Daniel hadn't noticed him yet. Thomas found a spot along the sideline where he could watch without being obvious, wanting to see his son in his element before announcing his presence. Daniel was laughing with his teammates, confident and comfortable in a way that made Thomas both proud and sad. Proud because his boy was thriving, sad because he had missed watching this confidence develop. Thomas. He turned at the sound of his name and found Sarah standing a few feet away, a coffee cup in her hands and surprise written across her face. She looked older than he remembered, but also somehow softer. Her hair was shorter, and she wore a simple jacket over jeans. For a moment, they just stared at each other. "I told Daniel I would be here," Thomas said quietly. "I hope that's okay." Sarah's expression was hard to read. "He's been talking about it all week. I wasn't sure you'd actually come," I said I would. "You've said a lot of things over the years, Thomas." The words stung, but Thomas nodded. She was right to be cautious. He had made promises before that work had forced him to break. This time is different. Before Sarah could respond, a shout came from the field. "Dad!" Daniel had spotted him. The boy broke away from his warm-up routine and ran toward the sideline, his face bright with excitement. Thomas felt his throat tighten as Daniel reached the barrier that separated the field from the spectators. "You came. You actually came." "Of course I came," Thomas said, kneeling down to be at eye level with his son. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Daniel grinned, the same gap-toothed smile from the photo Thomas carried, though the gaps had been filled in now. "Did you see me practicing? Coach says I might get to play striker today." "That's wonderful, son. I'll be watching every minute." "Ma'am, look. Dad's here." Sarah had approached quietly, and Thomas saw something complicated in her expression as she watched their son's joy. "I can see that, love. You'd better get back to your warm-up now. The match starts soon." Daniel nodded eagerly and ran back to his teammates, but not before turning to wave at Thomas one more time. The simple gesture filled Thomas with more happiness than any royal ceremony ever had. "He's been different since you started calling." "More regularly," Sarah said, settling into a folding chair nearby. Thomas remained standing, unsure of his welcome. "It's different how? Happier, more confident. He talks about you now, instead of avoiding the subject." She looked up at him. "Changed, Thomas?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching Daniel pass the ball with his teammates. I realized I was losing him, that he thought it was his fault I wasn't around. I couldn't live with that. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "He did think that for a while. It broke my heart." "Sorry," Thomas said, meaning it completely. "I'm sorry for a lot of things." The match began before Sarah could respond. Both teams took the field, and Thomas found himself gripping the barrier as Daniel ran onto the grass. The boy looked so small out there, but he moved with purpose and determination that reminded Thomas painfully of himself at that age. For the first 20 minutes, Daniel played defense, making several good tackles and clearing the ball when the opposing team pressed forward. Thomas cheered every time his son touched the ball, earning amused looks from other parents who seemed to recognize the enthusiasm of a father who didn't get to watch very often. Then, the 25th minute. Daniel's coach called him forward. "Mitchell, up front. Thomas watched with pride as Daniel jogged to the striker position. Sarah moved closer, standing beside Thomas at the barrier. "He's been working toward this all season," she said quietly. "Coach only puts the best players." Up front, the game continued, both teams evenly matched. Thomas found himself completely absorbed, his usual reserve forgotten, as he shouted encouragement and groaned at missed opportunities. At one point, he caught Sarah smiling at his enthusiasm. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. Just, I'd forgotten how passionate you get about things you care about." In the 40th minute, Daniel got his chance. A teammate passed the ball across the penalty area, and Daniel was there to meet it. Thomas held his breath as his son drew back his foot and struck the ball cleanly toward the goal. The goalkeeper dove, fingertips stretching, but couldn't reach it. The ball hit the back of the net, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Daniel threw, his arms up in celebration, his teammates rushing to congratulate him. "That's my boy," Thomas shouted, louder than he had ever cheered for anything in his life. He found himself jumping up and down like a madman, all dignity forgotten in the joy of the moment. When he looked around, he realized Sarah was crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from pure joy and pride. "He's been dreaming of scoring in the finals," she said, wiping her eyes. "He's going to remember this moment forever." Thomas felt his own eyes welling up. "So will I." Daniel looked toward the sideline and found them in the crowd. He pointed at Thomas and grinned before being pulled back into position for the restart. The simple gesture, the acknowledgement that his father was there to witness his moment of triumph, meant everything. The second half was tense, with both teams fighting hard. Daniel played brilliantly, creating chances and working tirelessly up front, though he didn't score again. His first goal proved to be the winner. When the final whistle blew, his team had won 1-0, and Daniel had scored the goal that took them to the championship. Thomas found himself hugging strangers, caught up in the celebration. When Daniel broke free from his teammates and ran toward the barrier, Thomas reached over and pulled him into the tightest hug of his life. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered into his son's hair. "So incredibly proud. Did you see it, Dad? Did you see my goal?" "I saw everything, son. Every minute, every play. You were magnificent." Over Daniel's shoulder, Thomas caught Sarah's eye. She was still crying, but she was smiling too. For the first time in years, they looked like a family again, united in their pride and joy for their son, as the celebration continued around them. Thomas felt the commemorative coin in his pocket. He had been planning to give it to Daniel, but now he realized the boy had already received the only gift that really mattered: his father's presence, his attention, his pride. This moment, this feeling of being exactly where he belonged, was worth more than any piece of silver. After the match, the celebration moved to the local pub, where parents and children gathered to toast the victory. Thomas found himself in unfamiliar territory, being just another proud father among many, rather than the distant figure in the ceremonial uniform. Daniel stayed close to his side, retelling the story of his goal to anyone who would listen, its excitement infectious. Sarah watched from a nearby table, nursing a cup of tea and talking quietly with other mothers. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the room, and Thomas would see something he hadn't seen in years. Not anger or resentment, but a kind of cautious hope. When the crowd began to thin, Sarah approached them. "Daniel, love, we should be getting home. You've got school tomorrow? Can Dad come for dinner?" Daniel asked immediately, looking between his parents with the innocent hope that only children possess. "Please, I want to show him my room and my trophies." Thomas held his breath. He had been planning to return to London that evening, but the invitation was too precious to refuse. Sarah would allow it. Sarah hesitated, clearly torn. "I suppose, if your father doesn't have other plans." "I don't," Thomas said quickly. "If you're sure it's okay." The walk to Sarah's house was awkward at first. Daniel chattered constantly, filling the silence between his parents with stories about school, his friends, and his football team. But as they walked through the quiet streets of the village, Thomas began to relax. This was what he had been, missing the simple pleasure of walking with his family, of being part of their daily world. Sarah's house was smaller than their old home, but it was warm and comfortable. Pictures of Daniel covered the mantelpiece and walls, school photos, football team pictures, awards, and certificates. Rana noticed that there were still a few family photos from their married days tucked between the newer ones. He was surprised. She had kept them. "My room's upstairs," Daniel announced, grabbing Thomas's hand and pulling him toward the staircase. "Come see." Daniel's bedroom was everything an 8-year-old boy's room should be. Football posters covered the walls, and shelves displayed various trophies and medals. A desk by the window held school books and a few drawings that Daniel had made. Thomas picked up one of the drawings, a stick figure family with a man in a red uniform. "That's you at the palace," Daniel explained. "I drew it after you told me about the pigeons." Thomas's throat tightened. Even in his absence, he had been present in his son's imagination. "It's wonderful, Daniel. Can I keep a copy?" "You can have that one," Daniel said generously. "I can draw another." They spent an hour in Daniel's room, looking at schoolwork and listening to stories about teachers and friends. Thomas realized how much he had missed, not just the big moments, but the small, everyday experiences that made up a child's life. Daniel showed him a book report he had written, a science project about planets, and a collection of rocks he had gathered from the school playground when Sarah called them down for dinner. Thomas felt reluctant to leave the sanctuary of his son's room. Downstairs would mean adult conversations, potential awkwardness, the reality of their complicated situation. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Sarah had made Daniel's favorite meal, spaghetti with homemade meat sauce, and the conversation flowed more easily than Thomas had expected. They talked about Daniel's school, his upcoming championship match, and his plans for the winter break. "Mum said we might go to London during the holidays," Daniel mentioned casually. "Maybe we could visit you at the palace." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed any such visit, but the hope in Daniel's voice made it impossible to disappoint him. "We'll see," Sarah said diplomatically. "London can be quite busy during the holidays." After dinner, Daniel insisted on showing his father a card game he had learned at school. As they played at the kitchen table, Sarah washed dishes nearby, occasionally joining in their conversation. The domestic scene felt both natural and surreal to Thomas. How long had it been since he had experienced anything like this? When Daniel began to yawn, Sarah declared it bedtime. "School tomorrow, remember?" Daniel hugged Thomas tightly. "Will I see you tomorrow before you go back?" Thomas looked at Sarah questioningly. He had planned to catch an early train, but if he could stay a little longer. "Your father probably needs to get back to his duties," Sarah said gently. "Actually," Thomas said, making a decision that surprised even him, "I have a few days of leave. If it's okay with your mom, maybe I could stay until Tuesday. We could spend some time together and I could drive you to school." Daniel's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Mom, can he?" Sarah looked uncertain. "Thomas, we should talk about this privately." After Daniel went upstairs to brush his teeth, Thomas and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the remains of their family dinner still around them. The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of hurt and misunderstanding. "Why are you really here?" Sarah asked finally. "And don't say it's just for the football match. You've missed plenty of important things before." Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm being transferred to the base near here. I'll be starting in January." Sarah stared at him. "You're leaving the Royal Guard?" "Yes. I've realized that being a good father is more important than being a good soldier." He met her eyes steadily. "I nearly lost Daniel. I could see him slipping away, starting to think he wasn't important to me. I couldn't let that happen." "What about your career? You've worked so hard to get where you are." "My career won't hold me when I'm old. It won't care about me when I'm sick. It won't remember me when I'm gone." Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "But Daniel will, and I want those memories to be good ones." Sarah was silent for a long moment. "You hurt us, Thomas. When you chose the Guard over family time after time. When you missed Daniel's birthday for that ceremony in Edinburgh, you were too busy to come to parent-teacher conferences or school plays. I know, and I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm not even asking for a second chance at marriage. I'm just asking for the chance to be the father Daniel deserves. And what if this transfer doesn't work out? What if you change your mind in 6 months and decide you missed the prestige in the ceremonies? Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the commemorative coin, placing it on the table between them. Do you remember this? Sarah picked it up, studying the intricate design. From the Diamond Jubilee. Daniel admired it when he visited. Last summer. I've been carrying it ever since, planning to give it to him as a gift. But today, watching him score that goal, seeing how proud he was that I was there, I realized this coin represents everything I got wrong. I kept trying to give him things instead of giving him myself. He took the coin back, holding it up to catch the light from the overhead fixture. I don't want him to have a coin that reminds him of my duties to the crown. I want him to have memories of his father being present for the moments that matter to him. Sarah's expression softened slightly. He has been happier since you started calling more regularly. I want to be more than a voice on the phone, Sarah. I want to be the father who drives him to football practice, who helps with homework, who's there when he's sick or scared or excited about something. I want to be part of his daily life, not just a weekend visitor. From upstairs came Daniel's voice. Ma'am, I'm ready for my story. Sarah stood up. He still likes to be read to at bedtime. Would you like to do it tonight? Thomas felt his heart skip. Yes, very much. As they walked upstairs together, Sarah spoke quietly. This isn't going to be easy, Thomas. We have a lot of hurt to work through. And Daniel. He's going to need time to adjust to having you around more regularly, I understand. I'm not expecting everything to be perfect right away. I just want the chance to try. Daniel was waiting in his pajamas, a worn copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in his hands. Will you read to me, Dad? Thomas settled into the chair beside Daniel's bed, opening the familiar book. As he began to read, Sarah lingered in the doorway for a moment before quietly leaving them alone. The sound of his father's voice reading. The beloved story was clearly a comfort to Daniel, who snuggled deeper into his pillow with a contented smile. When the chapter ended, Daniel was nearly asleep. Dad, he murmured. Yes, son. I'm glad you came to my match. So am I, Daniel. So am I. As Thomas turned off the bedside lamp and quietly left his son's room, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations about the future, about practical arrangements and old wounds that needed healing. But tonight, he was simply a father who had read his son a bedtime story. It was the most important job he had ever held. Thomas spent the next 3 days living a life he had almost forgotten was possible. Each morning, he woke up in the small guest room at Sarah's house to the sound of Daniel getting ready for school. He would come downstairs to find his son eating cereal at the kitchen table, school bag packed and ready, chattering about the day ahead. The first morning, Daniel had looked surprised to see him. You're still here? I told you I would be, Thomas replied, ruffling his son's hair. Ready for school? The drive to Daniel's school was only 10 minutes, but it became Thomas's favorite part of each day. Daniel would tell him about his teachers, his friends, the lessons he was looking forward to. Thomas learned about Mrs. Henderson, the strict but fair math teacher, and about Jamie, Daniel's best friend, who collected football cards. These were the small details of his son's life that he had been missing, the ordinary moments that made up childhood. On the second day, Thomas walked Daniel to his classroom. Other parents were doing the same, and Thomas felt the curious stares of mothers and fathers who knew Sarah but had rarely seen Daniel's father. A few approached to introduce themselves, mentioning how much Daniel had talked about his dad coming to the football match. He was so proud you were there, said Mrs. Patterson, whose son was in Daniel's class. He's talked about nothing else for 2 days. After dropping Daniel off, Thomas would spend time with Sarah. These conversations were careful at first, both of them testing the waters of a relationship that had been broken for so long. They talked about practical things, Daniel's school performance, his need for new football boots, his upcoming birthday in December. But gradually, they began to share more personal thoughts. Sarah told him about the loneliness of single parenthood, the weight of making every decision alone, the fear that she wasn't enough for Daniel. Thomas shared his own fears that he had waited too late to prioritize fatherhood. that Daniel might never fully trust him again, that he was making the biggest mistake of his career. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked on the second afternoon as they walked through the village park, leaving the royal guard behind. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I thought I would. I expected to wake up every morning feeling like I'd made a terrible mistake. But instead, I wake up excited to see Daniel, to be part of his day. Yesterday, when he showed me his science homework and asked for help with the math problems, I realized I'd rather help him with fractions than guard any palace in the world." That evening, Daniel had a football practice. Thomas stood on the sideline with other parents watching his son run drills and scrimmage with his teammates. The coach, a young man named Peter, approached him during a water break. "You must be Daniel's father," Peter said. "He's been telling everyone about his goal in the finals. You raised a good boy there." "His mother deserves most of the credit," Thomas replied honestly. "I haven't been around as much as I should have been." "Ow." "Well, you're here now. That's what matters to kids, showing up when it counts." After practice, the three of them went for fish and chips at the local pub. Daniel regaled them with stories about practice, demonstrating proper kicking technique with an imaginary ball. Other families were there too, and Thomas noticed how naturally Sarah interacted with the other parents. How well known and respected she was in the community. She had built a good life here, a stable life for Daniel. "Mom makes the best sandwiches." For school lunch, Daniel announced, tomato sauce on his chin. "All my friends wish they had her sandwiches." "8." Sarah blushed slightly. "It's nothing special, just normal sandwiches." "Could you teach me?" Thomas asked. "So when I move here, I could help with school lunches sometimes." Daniel's eyes widened. "You're really moving here? To our town?" Thomas looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. They had discussed it that morning how much to tell Daniel, how to prepare him for the changes ahead. "I'm going to work at the army base nearby," Thomas explained. "It means I'll be close enough to see you much more often, maybe even help drive." "You too, school and football practice." Daniel launched himself out of his chair and hugged Thomas so hard he nearly knocked over his drink. "This is the best thing ever. Until I tell Jamie. His dad only sees him every other weekend because of the divorce, but my dad is going to live here." Over Daniel's head, Thomas saw Sarah's expression, a mixture of happiness and apprehension. This was uncharted territory for all of them. The third morning brought a challenge. Daniel woke up with a slight fever and a sore throat. Nothing serious, but enough to keep him home from school. Sarah had to work, and for a moment, they both hesitated, unsure of the protocol. "I could stay with him," Thomas offered. "If you're comfortable with that?" Sarah looked uncertain. "Are you sure? He'll probably just sleep most of the day. It won't be very exciting." "I've missed 3 years of taking care of him when he's sick," Thomas replied quietly. "I'd like to try, if you trust me." So Thomas spent the day as a caregiver, bringing Daniel soup and juice, taking his temperature, sitting by his bedside reading stories. It was such a normal, parental thing to do, yet it felt monumental to Thomas. When Daniel dozed off in the afternoon, his small hand still holding Thomas's, the former royal guard felt more honored than he ever had standing at attention before. The Queen Sarah came home early, bringing medicine from the pharmacy and looking anxious. How was he? He slept most of the day, temperatures down a bit. He ate some soup at lunch. Thomas showed her the notes he'd kept, temperature readings. What Daniel had eaten when he'd taken medicine? "I think he's feeling better." Sarah studied the careful notes, and Thomas saw surprise in her face. "You kept track of everything?" "I wanted to do it right." That evening, as Daniel felt well enough to come downstairs for dinner, he announced, "Dad took really good care of me today. Made funny voices when he read stories, and he didn't get worried when I coughed a lot." After dinner, as Thomas prepared to leave the next morning, Sarah asked him to stay for a cup of tea after Daniel went to bed. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, settling into her chair with her mug, about wanting to be the father Daniel deserves. As Thomas waited, sensing this was important. "I was angry for so long," Sarah continued. "Angry that the royal guard seemed to matter more to you than we did. Angry that Daniel had to compete with ceremonies and duties for his father's attention. You had every right to be angry." "Maybe, But watching you these past few days, seeing how you are with him now, I think I was also angry because I was scared. Scared that you'd keep making promises and breaking them. Scared that Daniel would get his hopes up, only to be disappointed again. Thomas set down his tea, and now. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Now I think maybe I was wrong to be so protective. Daniel needs his father. He's needed you all along. I just didn't trust you to be there for him consistently. Do you trust me? Now, I want to. These 3 days, you've been the father I hoped you would be when Daniel was born. Patient, present, interested in the small things that mattered to him. If you can keep being that father, ... I can. I will. Thomas leaned forward. Sarah, I know I can't undo the hurt I caused. I know it will take time to rebuild trust. But I'm not the same man who put duty before family. Daniel changed me. Nearly losing him changed me. The next morning, Thomas's departure was tearful but hopeful. Daniel hugged him tightly at the train station. Will you call me tonight? Daniel asked. Every night, Thomas promised. And I'll see you again in 2 weeks, when I come to look for a place to live nearby. As the train pulled away, Thomas saw Sarah and Daniel waving from the platform. This time, the goodbye didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something new, something better than what they'd had before. The commemorative coin remained in Thomas's pocket, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a symbol of duty that kept him from his family. Instead, it had become a reminder of the most important lesson he'd ever learned, that love required presence. That fatherhood was a daily choice, and that some distances could only be closed by the decision to stop running away. 3 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood in the doorway of a small cottage just 2 miles from Sarah's house. Watching the morning sun stream through windows that would soon frame his new life, the moving truck had left an hour earlier, and cardboard boxes filled the rooms that would become his home. For the first time in 15 years, he would wake up somewhere other than military barracks. His transfer to the local base had gone smoothly. Recommendation and his new commanding officer, Major Williams, understood his situation and supported his priorities. The work was different, training recruits and handling administrative duties rather than the ceremonial grandeur of the Royal Guard. But Thomas found satisfaction in teaching young soldiers, sharing the discipline and pride he had learned over his career. Most importantly, he was now part of Daniel's daily life. Every morning, he would drive to Sarah's house to take Daniel to school. Every afternoon, he would be there for pickup, ready to hear about the day's adventures. Football practices, homework sessions, and weekend trips to the local cinema had become routine parts of his life. The change in Daniel was remarkable. The quiet, sometimes sad boy who had carefully guarded his emotions during weekend visits had blossomed into a confident, talkative child who shared everything with his father. Daniel's teachers commented on his improved focus and happiness. His football performance had soared. He had become the team's leading scorer and had even been selected for the regional youth development program. But perhaps more importantly, Daniel had stopped asking the hard questions about why his father lived far away. Instead, he had started planning their future together. When I'm older, will you teach me to march like the Royal Guards? He had asked one evening. Can we go camping this summer? Jamie's dad took him camping and it sounded amazing. Sarah had watched these changes with a mixture of relief and something else Thomas was afraid to name, hope. Their own relationship remained careful, respectful, but warm. She no longer tensed when he arrived to collect Daniel, no longer watched him with suspicious eyes when he made promises about future plans. Instead, she had begun including him in family decisions, asking his opinion about Daniel's education, his extracurricular activities, even his bedtime routine. You've become a real father to him, she had said one evening, as they watched Daniel practice football skills in her back garden, not just someone who visits. On this particular morning, as Thomas unpacked boxes in his new home, he was expecting Daniel and Sarah to arrive for lunch. It was Saturday, and they had planned to spend the day helping him settle in. Daniel had been excited about seeing his father's new house. It's about having a place where he could keep some of his things, where he might sometimes spend the night. The doorbell rang at exactly noon. Daniel burst through the door like a small hurricane, racing from room to explore every corner of the cottage. "Dad, this is brilliant!" he called from upstairs. "The back bedroom has a view of the football field behind the school." Sarah followed more slowly, carrying a casserole dish. "I thought you might not have had time to cook," she explained, setting it on the kitchen counter. "It's Daniel's favorite." Thomas felt touched by the gesture. These small kindnesses had become more frequent over the months, Sarah bringing him soup when he had been sick with flu, inviting him to stay for dinner after Daniel's football practices, including him in conversations about their son's future. They weren't a family in the traditional sense, but they had become something more than divorced parents managing custody arrangements. After lunch, Daniel insisted on helping unpack, though. His version of helping involved more playing with packing materials than organizing belongings. Sarah worked alongside Thomas in the kitchen, arranging dishes and cabinets and finding homes for his sparse collection of cooking utensils. "You don't have much," she observed, not critically, but with gentle amusement. 15 years of military? Housing doesn't encourage collecting household goods, Thomas replied. "I'm learning what it means to have a real home instead of just a place to sleep." As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah began gathering her things to leave. Daniel protested, wanting to stay longer, to explore more of the house and the neighborhood. "Another time, love," Sarah said gently. "Your father needs time to finish settling in." "Actually," Thomas said, feeling suddenly nervous, "I have something for Daniel, something I've been meaning to give him for a while." He went to his jacket and pulled out the commemorative coin, the same one he had carried for months, the one that had come to represent so much of his journey back to fatherhood. Daniel's eyes widened as Thomas placed the silver coin in his small palm. "It's beautiful, Dad. What is it?" "It's from the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, a very special ceremony I participated in when I was a royal guard." Thomas knelt down to be at Daniel's eye level. "I carried this coin with me every day, and whenever I felt lonely or missed you, I would hold it and think about how proud I was to be your father." Daniel turned the coin over in his hands, studying the intricate engravings. "It must be very important to you." "It was, but I realized something these past few months. The coin was supposed to remind me of you when we were apart, but now we're not apart anymore. Now I get to see you every day, and that's worth more than any coin or any medal or any honor I've ever received." Sarah had gone very quiet, watching the exchange with intense attention. "So I want you to have it," Thomas continued. "Not because it's valuable, though it is, but because I want you to remember that you are more important to me than any job, any duty, any responsibility. You are my greatest pride, Daniel." Daniel looked up from the coin, his young face serious. "Will you tell me stories about being a royal guard? About the ceremonies and the queen and the palace? I'll tell you anything you want to know, but those stories are about my old life. This house, this town being with you, this is my new life, and I like my new life much better." Daniel threw his arms around Thomas's neck, the coin clutched safely in his fist. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. More than you'll ever know." Over Daniel's head, Thomas saw Sarah wipe tears from her eyes. When their gazes met, he saw something in her expression that made his heart skip, the look of a woman seeing the man she had once fallen in love with, not the distant soldier he had become, but the person he truly was underneath the uniform and the duty. Later, after Sarah and Daniel had gone home, Thomas stood in his small kitchen making tea and looking out at the village where his son lived, where his son went to school and played football and laughed with friends. The cottage was quiet, filled with boxes still to unpack and a life still to build. But it felt more like home than any palace or barracks ever had. His phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Dad, I put the coin on my bedside table so I can see it when I go to sleep. Thank you for the best present ever." Thomas smiled, typing back, "See you Monday morning for school pickup. Sweet dreams, son." As he turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs to his new bedroom, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he had been a royal guard with a distinguished career and an empty personal life. Night he was simply a father who lived 2 miles from his son, who had traded ceremony for bedtime stories, prestige for presents. The commemorative coin was gone, passed on to Daniel as a symbol of love rather than duty. But Thomas didn't need it anymore. He had learned that a father's love wasn't measured by the distance he would travel or the sacrifices he would make in service to others. It was measured by his willingness to be present, to choose his child's needs over his own ambitions, to understand that the greatest honor wasn't serving the crown, but earning the trust and love of his son. Outside his bedroom window, Thomas could see the lights of Sarah's house in the distance. Tomorrow was Sunday, and Daniel had asked if they could go fishing at the local pond. It was such a simple request, the kind of ordinary father-son activity that Thomas had missed for years. But now, he had all the time in the world for fishing, trips and football practice, for homework help and bedtime stories. For all the precious, ordinary moments that make up a childhood, the Royal Guard's coin had closed the gap between father and son, not through its monetary value or historical significance, but through what it represented: a parent's willingness to put love before duty, presence before prestige, and family before everything else. Thomas Mitchell had finally learned the most important lesson of his life, that a father's greatest service is not to queen or country, but to the child who calls him dad.